So, quite a few developments. First of all, I'm almost out of my ethyl rubbing alcohol. I went to the store, and all I could find was isopropyl alcohol. I heard it might do the same thing. I haven't done any research, but the real test will be when I get a bunch of extra epoxy putty in my fingers and have to clean it off. We'll see how it does. So I'm using that. Additionally, I went to the store to pick up a toilet supply line. This supplies water to toilets, and wow, I just hit the camera. Anyway, they're available in a couple of different types: a bendable chrome metal one, a woven steel, as well as this woven PVC. And the thing is, I really don't want to. All the other materials I've been trying to use to redirect the airflow as needed just ain't cutting it. First of all, I need a more acute angle than 90 degrees, so I'd rather not be using this. After all, this vinyl tubing, when you bend it as far as I need it to, it does start to collapse and pinch off. So there's a definite problem. This woven stuff doesn't want to bend easily quite as far as I want it to go, but it doesn't flatten as much due to the braiding. And even though it does flatten a bit, the cross-section of this now oval-shaped tube here, the area of that cross-section should be about the same as the normal round unaffected tubing over here. So air delivery should be just fine. I've done some tests with this, blowing through one end, feeling the other, and it works just fine. So I'm going to be finding a way to use this for that airflow. I'm going to over-reinforce this plunger rod more than I think I need to, just because this is an important thing. When you start putting stronger springs into night finders, any blaster that has a plunger and a pull ring like this, you tend to see stress marks appearing around the pull ring and where the pull ring meets the plunger rod. So I'm going to fill that with epoxy putty completely. I sanded it out and cleaned it out inside as best I could. Same thing I'm going to do, fill these slots in the plunger rod, essentially just because, not as much because I think it needs it. So I'm going to be doing that next using my PC Plumbing epoxy putty. I don't remember if I already showed you this in a previous segment, but anyway, I got this stuff instead of the Ace brand thing that I was going to use, because this is supposed to stick to both PVC and ABS plastic, which is what Nerf shells are made out of. So next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to put all this epoxy putty where it needs to go, and then I will show you the process of attaching the plunger tube. One other thing, right above my finger, there's this gap here. This is both the catch retaining wall at the back and the, where did I put it? Here it is. And the spring rest. By filling that with epoxy putty, I'm hoping to serve the dual purpose of reinforcing both of those things. Just be sure you watch your tolerances when putting stuff in here, and also try to clean it out beforehand. I used cotton swab ear cleaners and rubbing alcohol. Make sure you're leaving room for everything that needs to move to be able to do so. Alright folks, a lot of things in this segment, and I'm getting very excited because I'm getting very close to being done here. Now, you look here at the shell, you can see I have put in my epoxy putty. This Plumbers stuff from PC is working incredibly well. It sticks to the plastic and it solidifies in a matter of minutes rather than hours, which is great for me because this project is going a lot faster now. You can see I've got my epoxy putty on the plunger rod, as well as that little spot in the catch. Now you have to make sure that is completely clean because this has to slide up and down. I just used a box cutter, ran it along the edge while the epoxy was still good. The other thing I did, let's see here, I removed a support post here. You've got to pull it off of both sides, otherwise you just don't have room for an air pipe to come down and then back up. And it's going to be pretty tight with the dart holder in place. as is. So you've got to remove those. They don't... Okay, this is just a structural post. It is not a screw hole. It is not a screw post, so you're not losing a screw. I'm going to clean this shell out, get all the extra debris out, put these in with a couple of dabs of hot glue, and you can see using a combination of hot glue and this Plumber's epoxy putty, I have finally sealed off the front of this plunger tube, and I've got my vinyl tube in there. I really wish I could fill a little more of that dead space around the head, but I just don't feel like sticking, trying to drip hot glue in there, and yeah, that's just tough. But with it all sealed up, I'm getting respectable airflow through this tube here, and you can see that I have cut my braided vinyl tube, and I used a pipe cutter. Where'd it go? A pipe cutter, usually used for brass and copper, to kind of get just a mark all the way around here, and then I cut it off using an X-Acto crafting knife, which is plenty sharp. Now, to make these things fit together, what I am doing is I am taking my knife and I am making the inside of this. Now be very careful here, because this is a very sharp knife and it will stick, and it is very close to your fingers. I am kind of hollowing out, making a cone-shaped thing, sort of a receiver, if you will. And you can see I'm cutting at an angle. Alright, not quite perfect, but it's getting there. And then what I'm going to do with this piece, first of all, I'm going to cut it much shorter. Second, I'm going to carve this so it kind of comes to, it's kind of cone-shaped, like this. And the receiver will be shaped like, well, the same thing. So hopefully these will be able to sit snug together, and then I'll seal it up with this epoxy putty, which is wonderful stuff, very wonderful stuff. And once this is all, I'm going to get that connected, attach these pieces here, and once all that is said and done, I will come back and show you the nearly finished product. So I got these shells all cleaned out, cleaned and dried, so there's no debris or anything left in them. I'm going to have to re-grease all the moving parts myself, though. Of course, the epoxy back here has set. Not cured quite yet, but it's set. And you'll see that these pieces here, I have indeed hot glued. Now, I was very careful to just hot glue around the edges and using a less is more approach, because this plunger tube rests right here against this curved piece of the plastic, and I don't want to interfere with that. Also, using cotton swabs with ethyl rubbing alcohol, I dug into this barrel, removed as much of the grease as I could, and I got almost all of it, dug around in here a bit, and I was able to get essentially all of the grease out, as well as a little piece of the silicone lubricant that was actually attached to one of the prongs on the air restrictor. I used these pliers to pull it out, and now it's as good as new. You'll also notice that in addition to sanding this entire back surface with a high grit sandpaper, I've taken my Dremel and carved some dashes into it and scuffed some deeper cuts, and that's just to give the epoxy putty as much surface area to adhere to as possible. So I'm about to mix my epoxy putty to attach the front of this plunger tube to the back of the triad head to make sure it's lined up correctly. I'm going to seat the plunger tube into the shell, put the epoxy putty on, put both shell halves together, then push the triad head into position and leave it there for a while. The good thing about this epoxy putty is that it doesn't take too long to set. Now, to make sure epoxy doesn't squeeze out and hit the shell and hold the whole thing together, you'll see that I've rubbed epoxy putty on the inside of both sides of the shell near the head, where the epoxy putty will be hardening. The blaster's been together for about an hour. It should be just about cured now. Going to take it apart. And there we go. It seems to be holding. Now I am going to add the air pipe and reinforce this connection. So while the 7 kilogram spring is plenty powerful, this air channel slows the air down quite a bit, and the mass of this plunger rod is much greater, probably double, because of all the epoxy put I put into there. Now, since that is strong enough to handle it, I'm going to do a spring addition to the 7 kilogram spring. What I have here is a stock spring for the TriadStrike, which I'm going to set aside, and this is 2 halves of a spring from Ace Hardware. Number 47 or 49, I'm not sure which, compression, and it nests almost perfectly inside the stock spring. I'm going to see in a second if this will in fact fit into the heavier duty spring. I think it will. You'll notice though that I have cut it in half because this won't compress far enough for the plunger rod to get far enough back to reach the catch. It just won't make it. So I cut it roughly in half, and this should compress. This slightly shorter half should compress enough to allow the catch to engage. Now this, of course, won't push the plunger rod all the way forward, but it'll add a lot of extra kick, and I'm hoping that'll do. And one thing to point out, well, okay, I cut this with a heavy-duty grinding disc. It wasn't with a Dremel, it was with a dedicated grinding tool, and I'm definitely going to use a small grinding disc on my Dremel to round the edge in here, because this is a very, very sharp break. I thought you guys just get a kick out of seeing some sparks, because I'm getting a lot of sparks off this. Again, I'm using this grinding disc to clean up the very sharp edge from where the large grinding disc cut this spring in half. And the sparks are actually quite impressive. So, my plunger rod's getting pretty beat up from winding springs on and off. I just removed the 7 kilogram spring in order to try and put on this number 47 or 49 from Ace, whichever is smaller spring, inside of it. And I've been you can see I put a permanent kink in the end to try and allow it to fit onto the rod and then bend around it. And I used 2 sets of pliers for that, so I could hold it down here with one and bend the other end up with the other. And I've come to the conclusion that this just isn't going to go on without removing the head or this the ring on the pull ring. I have a theory on how to do that, but I'm delivering this commission tomorrow, so when I go to make my own personal version of this blaster, I will try it then. I will document it and upload it if it in fact works. It includes cutting right in front of the ring, drilling a hole through the ring here at the front, epoxying them, and bolting them back together. I will give that a try when I go to make my own version of this blaster, but for the time being I'm just going to put this 7 spring back on. Next segment we'll be filling some dead space and we will be essentially done. Since I was unable to add a spring, I finished my epoxy putty work, and I am ready to say that once all the internals are put back in place and everything is greased, this blaster, this commission, is finally, at long last, completed. So, first thing you're going to see
is that I added more epoxy putty down here, right down or under the or below the middle line of the plunger tube, we'll say. That's because that gap had the most space to add putty inside the shell. It was down here. So I added that on both sides, including covering up part of the air transfer tube. Now, if I really needed to remove and replace this tube, I could still grind through that with a Dremel or saw, and that is still doable. I also added a little more putty, because I had mixed a little more than I needed, around all the way around the edges here, just to make sure all these pieces are held together in a very solid way. You'll notice, well, maybe you won't, right at the tip of my fingernail, there's an extra shiny spot. That is grease. Again, when you're working in the shell here, what you need to do, add grease on the insides of both sides of the shell before the putty sets, so immediately you want to seat the entire system in there. Then close it together and make sure it's all the way together. Squeeze the shell up right here a little bit, and the grease will keep the epoxy putty from sticking to the shell, but the point is that way you don't have to grind away any excess. There's a couple of spots, like as I mentioned here and right here, where you see it's kind of flat, maybe not. That's because that's where the shell came in contact, and since it was still malleable, it deformed a little bit, moved out of the way of the shell, and this is good to go once this cures in another, well, it cures in less than, definitely less than 24 hours. I think it's closer to an hour because this is for emergency plumbing repairs. But it'll set in just a couple of minutes, and this will all be good to go. Additionally, I reached in there and filled as much dead space as I could. I made long, thin rolls of the putty, pushed it down in there, and then pushed my finger in to push it flat. And so that should help with the air delivery a little bit, and it looks much nicer. So I'm going to get to greasing. I'll show you a shot of all the internals in place, and then we are done.